Welcome to the latest edition of Healthbeat, Bhekisisa's monthly television program. I'm Mia Malan. Today we're focusing on climate change and health. From rising sea levels to melting polar ice, the planet is changing faster than humans can adapt, and it's affecting our well-being. Higher temperatures and floods make diseases like cholera spread faster. And as freshwater sources dry up, people become more prone to malnutrition. A hotter earth also means people with lung conditions due to dirty air will suffer even more. Because Sasol and Eskom burn so much coal in Mpumalanga, the province has heavily polluted air. Secunda is one such town. We went to visit the town to speak to people who have been breathing the coal-laden air for decades.
I can't breathe during night, especially there are times where I can't breathe. Even when I walk, I can't walk a long distance. I feel like I'll fall down.
A toxic, hazy blanket of dirty air hangs over the horizon on the Mpumalanga Highveld. It's a silent killer, say those who live here.
We've got a problem with the air pollution here. Because we've got power stations around. More than 11 is killing us. It makes us sick.
Khehla Mahlangu has lived in Mbalenhle on the outskirts of Secunda his whole life. He had to quit his job as a manual laborer 17 years ago.
The doctor said, "You are sick. This area is not good for you." Yeah, they've done the test, and then he said, "Hey, the problem is it's your lungs. You can't breathe clearly. It's a respiratory problem."
Polluted air contains tiny bits of dirt and harmful gases. When inhaled, they can damage your lungs, causing lung infections and even lung cancer.
What's on those dust particles is the problem. So they might carry arsenic or mercury or cadmium or one of these other heavy metals, right? Tiny amounts. And when these particles are very small and you inhale it, it goes very deep into the body.
Jeremiah Maseko has lived in Mbalenhle for 46 years. He once worked at Sasol's tar plant, but 8 years ago he began struggling to breathe.
When you inhale, you can hear your lungs that there's something that is like a sound. When you can't inhale properly. So they did X-rays and even take me further to some specialists. And they also told me my lungs are not good.
Because the air temperature of the earth is rising, conditions could worsen for people like Khehla and Jeremiah, especially in summer.
Warming temperatures are especially a concern for people who have pre-existing diseases. So in other words, somebody who has asthma is often triggered by air pollution. But when it is very hot, a person's ability to balance the temperature out is compromised because they face this existing health challenge, which means that they may be triggered for an asthmatic attack.
Burning fossil fuels such as coal and oil, like at the Eskom and Sasol plants, releases gases into the air that add to the problem. They build up in the atmosphere and form a blanket around the earth, trapping heat.
The Sasol facility at Secunda is famous for being, I think, the largest point source of carbon dioxide in the Southern Hemisphere, but also large amounts of air pollutants, generally associated with the burning of coal.
It's a vicious cycle. The hotter the air gets, scientists say, the worse the effects of air pollution.
As temperatures are warming, the conditions are created which almost support or encourage air pollution creation. A lot of the pollutants that occur in the atmosphere are stimulated in the presence of sunlight. You're getting higher levels of pollution, and that pollution aggravates people who have respiratory diseases.
People often talk about air pollution and climate change as though they're interchangeable. As scientists, we like to distinguish between the two, but they are very linked because they have the same sources.
Let's take this further now with Professor Karadi Wright. Karadi, we've of course heard your brief input in our insert. Can you break down in a little bit more depth why would climate change, so a warmer Earth, make air pollution worse?
So there's two ways that climate change is going to make air pollution levels worse than what we're seeing now. The first is the temperature in the atmosphere is changing. And with the change in temperature, the chemistry of how things are made up changes. And when the conditions are just right, certain chemicals can break down and reform into different chemicals, and this then generates air pollution. So that's the one way that it happens. The other is more related to behavioral change. So in a warmer climate or in a cooler climate, because in fact climate change doesn't just mean warming, we can also still get cold snaps, people will resort to burning of potentially solid fuel like wood or coal or kerosene, paraffin and so on, as a means to heat their homes, or when there's a shortage of electricity, the means to cook. And these activities within the homes then produce air pollution, which then goes outside and increases these air pollution levels.
You've also mentioned that people who already have lung problems because of air pollution will now suffer more because when it's warmer, your body now needs to cope with the heat, and it could also trigger, for instance, you mentioned an asthma attack. So what does that mean for our health system?
This is a grave challenge for our healthcare system. We know that the health system in South Africa is already triply burdened. Not just because of the caseload, but because of the capacity in terms of staff shortages, as well as stockouts in terms of drugs. So if we are going to see an influx of people who are struggling during periods of intense heat, which does exacerbate certain respiratory illnesses, we are not going to be able to serve those people in the way that they need it with the immediate attention to try and prevent further adverse effects. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of preparing our healthcare system as a whole, in terms of the infrastructure, the buildings, the capacity among our staff, the skills and the knowledge to recognize the types of illnesses that are going to be triggered during these types of heatwave events.
Things like pandemics or events like climate change almost always do is that they show us in which world we live, what that world looks like, so they magnify the problems that we have. So how do we deal with climate change within the context of inequality?
The changes that we've seen in our communities in terms of socioeconomic status, not only during the pandemic, but pre-pandemic and continuing on today, means that certain people are not able to have the adaptive capacity or the agency to implement changes themselves in their own lives to protect their health. That means they need to rely on the healthcare system and services to give them either the preventative medication or the treatment that they need to ensure that their health and well-being is maintained. Going forward, because we're going to see an increase in these cases, it's very concerning that we are not necessarily going to be able to help the people who need the help the most. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, according to our Gini coefficient. And this is going to only be exacerbated in the face of a changing climate.
So we should, in effect, use climate change to speed up our efforts to address inequality that was already there before climate change, but that will be made worse by climate change.
That's exactly right. And this is something like what the World Health Organization proposes, that you have health in all policies. And what we are lobbying for now is climate change to be addressed in all policies because it affects every aspect of life.
Can you give me an example of where climate change needs to be worked in where it wasn't previously?
So, for example, in the food chain, keeping food cool throughout the process from farm to fork, essentially, is tricky when temperatures are warmer. But we need safe food for people to eat, to keep and maintain their health. So an example of that is using different energy sources to fuel the cooling, refrigeration in these trucks. And we hope one day we'll get to the point where we'd see something like solar power being used. At the moment, there's introduction of electrical powering of these vehicles. That's just one way in which we are trying to adapt through the policy of the National Climate Change and Health Adaptation Plan onto something in the ground to try and help people's health.
Carrie Wright, thanks very much for making the time for us today.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
After the break, we speak to Kumi Naidu, a climate justice activist. Stay with us. Experts say poverty, malnutrition and overcrowding will worsen as floods and droughts become more common because of climate change. But what exactly causes weather patterns to change? We put together this animation.
Our planet needs to be warm to sustain life. There's a natural way to keep it at the right temperature. It's called the greenhouse effect. It works much like the glass roof of a greenhouse, letting in the sun's heat during the day and keeping the temperature cozy inside at night. Burning fossil fuels like oil and coal emit gases that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. These human activities are making the air warmer than it should be. The rising air temperature is called global warming. It drives changes in long-term weather patterns, also known as climate change. Because the Earth's an interconnected system, a change in one place causes a change elsewhere. So it gets wetter and stormier in some places and hotter and drier in others. The changes upset the Earth's natural climate balance, causing more extreme weather events more often.
Kumi Naidu is an Oxford scholar and also a former director of Greenpeace and Secretary General of Amnesty International. But above all, he's a human rights and climate activist. And currently, he's working on a research project that looks at the impact of climate anxiety on young people. Kumi, thanks very much for joining us. We do appreciate you making the time. What is climate anxiety?
So the reality we face is that the science has been telling us for decades that we need to get off fossil fuels. That's oil, coal, and gas, because that is what is driving climate change in the main. Right now, if we continue to behave as we are, with our government still investing in dirty energy, for example, that we will be able to prevent what the scientists call irreversible, catastrophic, runaway climate change. So that's climate anxiety is the sense that the window of opportunity to prevent the worst of climate change is small and it's closing fast. It hasn't completely closed, but we are like 5 minutes to midnight. And that's where the anxiety comes from.
So it's the fear of what will happen if we can't fix this. And how will that impact on young people? That's what you're looking at in your research project, right?
So young people, sadly, are paying the price for my generation and earlier generations' failure to do the right thing. I was in a march around the United Nations in 2019, about 1 million people and so on. And there were 2 young girls in the march, right? They were probably 14, 15. And they were both sisters holding a sign saying, "Sorry, Mama, you're not going to be a grandma," because they've decided And this is the thing, there are lots of young, informed people around the world who are now saying, wow, if this is where the world is going, is it responsible to even be thinking about having kids?
I would like to zoom in a little bit on the activism part for people like yourself. You've referred to young activists and the kind of constant fight that they have against very powerful people. Things are moving very slowly. And climate activists also frequently get arrested. You've been arrested in the past. What does that mean for your state of mind?
To be honest, that is not what gives me and many activists anxiety, but it comes from sitting in meetings with heads of government, powerful CEOs of corporations. They will agree with you when you present the science to them, and then when they walk out of the door, it's business as usual. With climate, the science is very clear. We got till 2030 to get emissions to peak and drastically start coming down.
So what do you do when you wake up in the mornings and you have those feelings? How do you cope? What are your support systems to keep your mental health intact?
So for me, the more down I feel, the more I want to try to see how do I be as active, creative, and energetic to educate people about the crisis we're in. And for me, that's the best sort of way of dealing with my mental health. Participation is the antidote, is the best antidote I know for addressing the sense of anxiety. But doing something positive, even if it's not going to solve the entire problem, but if it solves a piece of the problem on the one hand, but it also gives you confidence that actually coming together, you have power and capability to make a difference.
Kuminadi, thanks very much for your time today. Almost 7 out of 10 people with HIV live in sub-Saharan Africa. Will climate change affect how fast the virus spreads? HIV treatment, for instance, needs to be taken daily. So what happens with access to treatment during floods? Joining me via Zoom from Tanzania is James Crispin. He is a medical doctor and a researcher specializing in the impact of climate change on infectious diseases. James, thanks so much for joining us today. Do floods make it harder to get your HIV treatment?
Yes, it is very true that floods make it harder for individuals with HIV in our country, Tanzania, and globally to access good treatment, care, and outcome of the treatment, because floods make to the destruction of the infrastructure and also health facilities in general. So they are not really able to offer good service to people with HIV. But also we have seen floods affect the people who are living with HIV because they lost their CTC card. CTC card is among the follow-up treatment and also the disease progress of the people in their clinic. Some people, they even complain that they've lost their medication because of a flood. But again, we can see floods has destroyed transportation such as road, and it is so hard for some people to assess treatment and preventive care on HIV. But also we have seen floods cause migration of people because some people need to shift to other areas so that they can have less frequency of floods. And it's so sad because some people, they must be forced to travel to other places where they are far from treatment service. So they are lost to follow up and they cannot be tracked.
James, so if people can't get their treatment during floods, then someone with HIV's immune system would of course get weaker, and that would open them up to getting infections that they would normally not get when they're on ARVs. So how does that impact on the spread of diseases such as TB or pneumonia during floods?
People who are having with HIV, they're already having a weakened immune system, and they are more likely to get infections such as TB and pneumonia. But in people where they're staying in areas with flood, they are more likely to get these diseases because flooding have make people to move to the crowded camp, because some of the areas, for example, here in Tanzania, when floods come, some people they must be asked to go to live in the rescue camps. During floods, they come, it destroys the sanitation, and also the outbreak of waterborne diseases and other opportunistic infections.
Do people have more risky behavior, sexual behavior, during floods that will make it easier to get HIV?
Yeah, it is so generalized, but I believe yes, during flood area, people they are more likely to get risky sexual behaviors, and they'll put them at risk to acquire HIV. I can talk of a vivid example. We've seen now a growing burden where people they do transactional sex for food and money. So during floods, there are people they already have economic and social stressors where they use transactional sex for living. So some people they are forced to having transactional sex for money and food, of which this predisposes them to more likely to get HIV.
You've spoken about social and economic stresses during floods now. So what's the impact on mental health then?
These challenges really affect the mental health, because people they get depression, they get anxiety, and particularly for people who are already having also HIV, mental health is very important because they need to have good adherence to their medication. So mental health is very essential, because if someone is not mental okay, will not be able to adhere for medication and good follow-up to their clinic. So there are some of the reported cases of missed visits in the clinics, and some people they're not really having good adherence to their medication, and which will affect the outcome of the researchers' HIV.
James Crispin, thanks very much for your time today. So there you have it. Looking after our climate is also looking after our health. That's our Health Beat. Stay well.